Wendy Ulrich, Dr. Wendy Ulrich, was a psychologist in Ann Arbor, Michigan for 20 years before moving to Montreal, Quebec for a recently completed 3-year mission, and that's where I met her and her husband. She has served as president of the Association of Mormon Counselors and Psychotherapists, has authored numerous professional articles in both psychology and business, and has done consulting and training for such corporations as Marriott, Johnson & Johnson, University of Michigan, General Electric, and United Way. Dr. Ulrich is founder of 16 Stones Center for Growth in Alpine, Utah, providing seminar retreats for LDS members seeking personal and spiritual growth and development. She and her husband have 3 children. Her talks are always well worth it, and so please welcome Dr. Wendy Ulrich.
So hopefully you've had a few minutes to consider the questions on page 1 that look like this. And let me explain number 6 just a little if you're wondering what the heck I'm talking about. What I mean by that is just the ordinary frustrations that you experience as a child. So my parents made me go to bed when I didn't want to. I was always trying to get my father's approval. My mother wouldn't shut up and listen to me, just the normal things. And then what was your typical response in those situations? So if you have a minute to work on those questions for just a few minutes, the rest of this discussion will perhaps be a little more meaningful. Jesus opened his ministry with the words from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind." Healing the blind was one of Christ's most often repeated and most spectacular miracles. I have a friend who developed serious eye problems as a child. Her vision was 2800, which basically means she could barely read the big E on an eye chart. Without Coke bottle thick glasses, she couldn't read anything from road signs to the expression on her grandson's face. And then a few months ago, a 10-minute LASIK procedure restored her sight completely. She wakes up for the first time able to read her alarm clock without glasses. Unfortunately, there is no LASIK surgery as yet for the psychological and spiritual myopias that we deal with. Jesus taught that he had come not only to heal the physically blind, but to unveil the spiritual blindness of those who thought they could see quite clearly. When the Pharisees asked him sarcastically, "Are we blind also?" he replied, "If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, we see, therefore your sin remains." The Pharisees and priests were not only blind, but even more detrimentally blind to their own blindness. They not only could not see the Savior for who he was, but they saw him through a glass darkly as someone he was not, a blasphemous, demonic Sabbath breaker doing magic tricks to mislead people. Their blindness to their blindness led them to condemn and crucify him instead of seek him out for healing and sight. Not being able or willing to see our blindness prevents us from seeking the corrective lenses and healing surgeries we need as well. For example, we might not see how our experience on a high school basketball team is skewing our view of the Mountain Meadows massacre, or how our relationship with an emotionally distant mother causes us to misperceive our stake president. We may be blind to the ways we choose the questions we ignore and the questions we think matter, or the options we can think of for answering those questions. Our spiritual and emotional blindness alters our vision of God and affects our relationships with one another. It affects what we perceive as sin and how serious a sin. It limits our ability to recognize the Spirit even when we think we are honestly searching for truth. Even if we are not totally blind, we may be short-sighted or have poor peripheral vision, or be colorblind, or need bifocals that allow us to look at some things one way and other things another way. There are spiritual and emotional counterparts to all of these vision deficits. Of course, there are hundreds of legitimate questions, problems, organizational flaws that deserve legitimate inquiry and remedy, but when we're frustrated or doubtful or questioning, it is at least worth wondering if our history, our organizational structure, our biology, the meaning we give our experience, may be creating a blindness we can't see the first vision. Joseph Smith Sr.'s drinking may deeply frighten one person while amusing or even comforting another. An interaction with a church leader that frustrates and infuriates me may leave you wondering why I am overreacting. From where each of us sits, our particular questions and frustrations seem not only reasonable, but like the only rational response, unless one is deluded or has blinders on. Yet someone else with a different background or temperament may have a completely different set of sensibilities. For this reason, it helps to consider the personal and psychological, as well as the historical or scientific aspects of issues that trouble us. So today I'd like to explore briefly some of the sources of blindness that might interrupt our ability to resolve our spiritual crises or questions, and some of the corrective lenses we might consider to help us learn to see the face of God in clearer focus. As we look at the influence then of our early experience, we become quickly aware that that experience has tremendous impact on our capacities for spiritual sight. For example, when I walk out into the desert on a clear night, I can pick out a few constellations, but I will never see the stars the way my father does. And they will never have the same meaning to me. I've had people tell me probably 100 times how to find the North Star, the North Star from the Big Dipper, but I can never keep it straight. I can't see the North Star unless someone is actively pointing it out to me. I am North Star blind, if you will. But my pilot father learned to navigate by the stars in the days before radar. He remembers clearly when his life depended on finding the tiny dot of an aircraft carrier in an endless night sea by the wits of celestial navigation. He has 20/20 vision for the North Star, because his prior experience with it is much different than mine. His early experience with the stars is different, and it leads him to a different way of seeing the world we share. Some types of blindness are more common to the human experience than others, like the creeping blurriness of age. Others are more idiosyncratic, like the particular combination of two-directional astigmatisms that plague the contact lens makers of one of my sight-challenged colleagues. But when the explanations about a problem with church history, policy, or doctrine that satisfy one person do not satisfy me, I am left to wonder which of us needs the glasses. Some questions that help me recognize and accommodate to my possible spiritual blind spots include number 7 through 11 on the other side of your sheet. What is the question, issue, or situation in the church that troubles me? What is it about this issue that stands out to me as the problem? What is the problem this issue creates or exemplifies for me? When have I faced a similar problem, and how did I face it? If the church is true, what does this issue make me wonder about God? If I accept the church's viewpoint on this issue, what might it mean about me? So maybe you could write down a one-sentence description under number 7 of a question or issue or situation in the church that has troubled you or troubles you currently. Let me give you some quick examples. DNA research on Book of Mormon people that seems to contradict the book's claims about its origins might be an example. I don't understand the church's position on homosexuality in today's world. How can God be behind the choice of my bishop, who is not ethical in a business dealing with me? I hate everything about polygamy. So you might make a note. What's one of those issues been for you? And I'm not trying to suggest that we don't have every right to take a hard look at the science of DNA research, or the holes in our understanding of homosexuality, or the nature of revelation about church callings, or the history of polygamy, but I am suggesting that we may have an easier time exploring these issues logically, helpfully, and creatively if we have a reasonably clear understanding of how the issue affects us personally, how it taps into our historical injuries or betrayals, and thus how our vision may be blurred about that subject. As an example, let's take polygamy, often a loaded issue for people, but one I've learned as a psychologist is loaded very differently for different folks. When I ask Pat what stands out for her as a problem with polygamy, her attention goes primarily to Joseph Smith apparently having lied to his wife and others about his polygamous relationships. For someone else, the bigger problem may be Joseph Smith's involvement with young women, or the potential for abuses of power, or the possibility of having to live polygamy again. But for now, let's consider how Pat might answer these questions. What is the question? We'll look at polygamy. For her, it was specifically about his lying to his wife. What's the personal problem this issue exemplifies or creates for me? If my husband were doing this, I'd feel betrayed. This exemplifies the way men cheat on their wives and justify it any way they can. When have I faced a similar problem? My father cheated on my mother and lied about it for years. I felt betrayed, and like men could not be trusted when I learned about it. If the church is true, what does this issue make you wonder about God? Makes me wonder if God can be trusted either. I can't tolerate a God like that. I'm not sure I can stay in a church that makes me think God would allow a prophet to lie to his wife. If I accept the church's viewpoint, what might it mean about me? It might mean I'm one of those women who let men walk all over them and are so dependent on them they will tolerate deceit and lies. So we begin to see how Pat's background and history affects the options that she can see, the options that she can legitimize, the options that she can tolerate. This issue was one that Pat began to explore and look at in her own history, realizing that her history with a promiscuous parent colored somewhat how she viewed Joseph Smith and in turn how she viewed God. After some thought about this, she writes, I realized as I approached the topic of polygamy that I have a real sensitivity to the issue of men lying to their wives about sexuality. This issue has impacted me personally and deeply. I have a hard time imagining that Joseph Smith could have had any other motivation than self-indulgence and self-protection in his handling of polygamy. But I can also see that someone without my background might not jump so quickly to that conclusion and might be freer to see different meaning in his behavior. I once had a strong testimony of Joseph Smith, just as I had a strong love for my father. So I tend to assume similarities, but there may be important differences I don't see as well. As Pat considers the possibility that there might be other ways to see polygamy, even though she cannot as yet imagine them very well, she at least has the option of holding on to both her testimony of Joseph Smith and her desire to not tolerate deceit and lies from men she loves. She may not yet know how to reconcile these images, but as she takes into account her own possible blind spots, she can begin to explore this issue with a little less defensiveness and a little more openness to other ways of seeing. As another way to explore how our prior history affects our view of God and the church, let's go back to questions number 1 through 6, in case you're thinking that you're off the hook here. The ones I asked you to complete before I began. I'd like you to take a moment and review your answers to those questions. They're adapted from some exercises used by marital therapy theorist Harville Hendricks. Hendricks, who is quite well known for some of his ideas, believes that each of us is inexorably attracted to a partner who will recreate with us the primary challenges of our childhood. We invest this person with the hope that this time the outcomes will be different, however. A false hope, I might add. In other words, we are specifically drawn to people with whom we are, by definition, completely incompatible. We are. You think this is funny?
We've been married 20 years.
You've been married 20 years, It is kind of funny, isn't it? People that we are drawn to as marriage partners are those who will help us recreate the exact puzzling, problematic issues that hurt us as children and that we are consciously determined to avoid in adulthood. But we are drawn to these people who help us recreate these problems in just enough of a different guise to fool us into thinking we have finally found someone utterly unlike our parents and who will at last meet our deepest needs. They will indeed meet our deepest needs, but only if we assume that our deepest needs are to figure out how to solve the unsolved problems of the past generations by our own courageous effort to change and learn and grow into the solutions we never could pull off as a child. And not that our deepest needs are for someone else to finally stop treating us the way our family did and thus make us feel safe and secure at last. Not laughing anymore, are we? To be sure, my spouse's repetition of my familiar and familial patterns may take a different form from what I saw at home, but it will still evoke similar feelings, beliefs, self-images, and responses in me. My spouse will also be attracted to me because I evoke familiar but troubling feelings, beliefs, self-images, and responses that plagued him. He's here today, so we'll see how this goes when I get home. And we will then both have the challenge of finding a response other than to assume it is now the other person who must change. Let me give you an example of this. Luke is a dentist. He was the youngest child in a large family in which children were no longer a novelty. His father was critical of the children, preoccupied with work, and his mother sad and almost invisible, leaving Luke anxious about his place. He learned to get attention by friendliness that bordered on intrusiveness and antics that bordered on goofiness, to which his parents responded with either mild amusement or irritation. Luke was initially attracted to Sandy because of her calm, self-effacing manner, so unlike his self-centered father. But after years of marriage, Sandy's aloof style is making him feel as invisible as he did as a child, unless he is provoking her to irritation with his inappropriate behavior. He blames her for being bored and preoccupied with her work, but the more he acts out, the more she criticizes or withdraws, making him feel yet more invisible and ignored. Luke vaguely suspects that his behavior evokes the very reactions he desires, but when he feels anxious about his place with Sandy, he really can't imagine anything to do other than provoke some response from her by his silliness. The response he wants is her attention, amusement, and engagement, but the response he gets inexplicably to him is withdrawal and criticism. I am fascinated by Hendrick's theory because it explains so much about what is otherwise inexplicable about marriage, including my own marriage, but I also think that it may help explain a few things about how we relate to God and even to the church. So let's go down to questions 12 through 17. For number 12, I have unconsciously spent my life searching for a God, a church, and religious leaders with these traits. Write in the answers you circled from number 1. What I tend to look for, number 13, what I tend to both look for and fear, however, are evidences that God, church, or religious leaders are really. Write in the answers you wrote and circled for number 2. Getting more interesting? Number 14, I unconsciously expect God, church, and leaders to make me feel. Write in what you circled for number 3. Number 14, I unconsciously expect them to make me feel what I circled for number 3. 3. Sorry, number 3. Should be number 3. Should be number 3. And then I wish God, church leaders, would give me number 4, even though unconsciously I don't think they will. Then when my needs are not met or I am under stress, I often feel, write down what you wrote for number 5. When my needs are not met or I'm under stress, I often feel number 5, and I assume that God or the church is responsible for my feelings. Interesting, huh? And finally, and then I often respond this way. Write in what you wrote down in the right column for number 6. When what I really need to do to heal and grow is whatever you think the opposite of number 6 would be. Again, this is adapted from Harville Hendricks' Getting the Love You Want. Let me give you some examples of what I mean by the opposite of number 6, because this is really important, because this is where we can really grow. Let's say that one of the frustrations you experienced with your parents was that you felt like they ignored you, like Luke's parents up above. His response was to get nervous and to act out to try to get attention. So what would be the opposite of acting out to get attention? It might be asking more directly for time and involvement from his parents. It might be acting responsibly and courteously rather than acting goofy. It might mean acknowledging the anxiety he feels and finding more ways to soothe and comfort himself. Those could all be opposites to what he learned to do. So if you can't think of a good opposite to what you wrote down in the right-hand column for number 6, maybe you could ask the person next to you to help you figure one out, to expand your repertoire a bit. Does anyone have a response that they wrote down, something that they did as a child that they can't think of a good opposite for? That you'd be willing to admit to 200 people that you don't know? Yeah. Escaped into books. What would be an opposite to escaping into books? What's that? Illiteracy? No, we don't want to go there. Okay. To do something. Instead of just escaping into the book, to do something active, to engage the person that you were involved with. Probably you learned, however, that didn't work very well when you were a child, or you would have figured that out. And so this is part of the reason that these responses are very challenging for us as adults. We probably tried some of those opposite things and got nowhere with them when we were kids, or we may have gotten criticized, or we may have gotten anger. And so we're kind of nervous about trying those things as adults. And it takes some real effort to take the courage to try something opposite to what we learned to do when we were children. Now, not everyone will have a major aha moment with this exercise, but it can give us another perspective from which to see. Of course, Harville Hendricks uses this exercise to help us better understand our relationship with our spouse, but I found that it works, for me at least, quite well in trying to understand better my relationship with my God, my church leaders, and the things that I have come to expect from them, the feelings that I have that are evoked whenever I'm under stress, but that I ascribe to them, and the things that I can do differently that might help me have a better response from them than what I'm used to. This exercise, however, was developed for people who are in love with each other, and I might even propose that many of us fell in love with the church, precisely because we thought it solved a major heartache or deficiency or problem we once faced. And our love affair is later threatened by precisely the situations that we feel put us right back where we were, in terms of feeling helpless, abandoned, blamed, betrayed, and stuck. Coming to this understanding does not solve all our problems with the church, of course, but it does open up the possibility that we are misperceiving some aspects of these problems from old and familiar blind spots that we can make an effort to correct for. Especially helpful to me is the second part of that number 17 question that suggests that what I really need to do in these situations in order to grow is the opposite of what I learned to do as a child. That overlearned childhood response is probably responsible for keeping me stuck with an old and unworkable solution in my present life. And the opposite response will generally be the hardest, most counterintuitive response for me, but the one that will help me get unstuck. The one that increases my agency instead of leaving me at the mercy of other people or God or the church to change in order for me to feel better. Exploring the idea of what caused us to fall in love with the church a little bit more, consider the question, what are 2 or 3 things that attracted you to the church when you first began exploring it for yourself? For example, if I fell in love with the church because it promised me personal revelation and a sense of belonging, then I may feel particularly betrayed when the process of personal revelation seems to backfire, or be untrustworthy, or when I feel left out or ignored. If I fell in love with the church because it provided answers to my important questions, then I may especially struggle when it seems there are important questions the church isn't answering. If I fell in love with the church because it promised I would again see my dead brother, whom I fought with right before he died, then I may have a particularly hard time accepting unresolved conflicts. So you may want to also consider the question, how might the things in the church that trouble you feel like a betrayal of that early promise? Another common challenge in marital couples is that the very things that attract them to each other become the things that drive them crazy over time. I was very attracted to my husband when I first met him because of his work ethic. He was extraordinarily hardworking. I knew I would never starve married to this man because whatever it took, he would bring home an income. Guess what drives me crazy about my husband today? Any guesses? He's never home, right? That's not true, but yeah, that's the thing then, that over time, the flip side of whatever that is that attracted us to the person becomes the thing that starts to get on our nerves. This is often because there's a weakness that goes with any strength. A flip side of the coin that is the exaggeration or the dark twist on a trait that we love. So if I'm drawn to my spouse because of his outgoing personality and friendliness with strangers, in time I find myself becoming infuriated that he is always drawing me into conversations I'd prefer to avoid, or because casual acquaintances seem to matter to him more than I do. So as you look at number 18, what you wrote down for number 18, about what you loved about the church when you first decided to embrace it, what would be the flip side of that coin? That is, what's the problem created by having too much of that thing you loved or of it getting out of balance? For example, if you love the idea of God calling a prophet today who would provide direction and guidance in a troubled world, are you also bothered by the constraints of too many rules to follow? Or do you get annoyed that people don't seem to think for themselves? From another angle, do you get overly frustrated with people who don't seem to be following the prophet, or annoyed that the prophet won't be clearer about what is expected on some things? These are the flip sides of the coin that come with the blessing of having a living prophet. We really can't get the side of the coin we like without getting the other side of the coin that we don't like so well. As we look at the things that irritate us in others, including spouses, God, and church leaders, sometimes we find that we also tend to get angry with people for things we don't give ourselves permission to do, even though we sometimes need to do that thing. For example, I may get annoyed with my friendly, outgoing husband because I really don't give myself permission to be friendly. But I insist instead on seeing myself as too shy to act that way. I may get irritated with church leaders who are dogmatic or rule-bound precisely because I don't really stick to my guns on things that matter to me. Don't give myself permission to insist on some things even when it's difficult or when I confront opposition. Or to admit that sometimes I have to take a stand and act even when there are other legitimate points of view. I had a fun example of this one with my daughter lately, who's into colors. Everybody's got a color, you know, you're a red and you're a yellow and you're a blue and I don't know. And we were talking about the fact that neither one of us did very well with yellow people. And then I started thinking about this issue. Why do yellow people irritate me? Well, yellow people, just in case you're not into this, are people who are motivated by having fun. And I thought, why do yellow people annoy me? That seems like that should be a good thing. And then I started thinking, I don't do so well at having fun. I don't really give myself a lot of permission to have fun. I see fun as being sort of a frivolous thing that we don't have time for if we're going to be serious and important. And so I don't let myself do that. I don't let myself be very yellow. So yellow people annoy me. But really what it boils down to is I need more yellow in my life. So are there ways that you get angry with the church for behavior or attitudes you actually need more of in your life, but don't allow yourself? Do you get upset with other people's blind obedience when in fact trust in things you don't fully understand is something you just don't allow yourself because it seems too dangerous? But your lack of trust is actually creating problems and keeping you out of balance, or whatever it might be. Recognizing blind spots, of course, does not cure them, but it does allow for the possibility of tackling these issues from a different angle. As long as we assume that we are being reasonable and conscientious when we tackle a doubt or a question, then our solution will be to examine the science and the logic and the reasonableness of the available answers. But when we assume that at least some of the questions that trouble us may be affected by our blind spots, as well as by history or logic, we get new